Sometimes all someone needs is a plate of rice, a genuine look, and someone who won't walk away. Talia had no degree, no money, no protection, but she had something none of them could offer: humanity. She saw an invisible boy. She loved when everyone else treated him like a case. And even when humiliated, she chose not to seek revenge. She chose to remain dignified. If it were you, would you have stayed? Would you have forgiven? Would you have gone back for that boy? Perhaps the world doesn't change through grand revolutions. Perhaps it changes every time someone chooses to care, even when it's not their obligation. Every time someone says, "I'll stay," when everything pushes them to leave. Talia lost everything, and at the same time, gained more than anyone can measure. And you? What would you do in her place? Would you follow with pride, or with your heart? If this story touched you in some way, like, share, and follow the channel. Someone might need to hear this today. And perhaps, deep down, we're all just another version of Daniel, waiting for someone like Talia. The bitter Auckland wind cut through the thin walls of Aroha Cafe like a knife through paper, and Talia Ngahuia pulled her fraying cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she wiped down the same sticky table for the third time that morning. The ancient heating system wheezed and groaned, putting out barely enough warmth to fog the windows, and the familiar ache in her lower back reminded her that she'd been on her feet for nearly 6 hours straight. At 29, Talia had perfected the art of invisibility. Her raven black hair, thick with the stubborn waves that marked her Maori heritage, was scraped back into a practical ponytail that had seen better days. Her cardigan, once a deep forest green, now faded to the color of old moss, hung loose on her slight frame. The sleeves rolled up to reveal work-worn hands that moved with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had learned to make every motion count. The cafe itself was a tired old thing, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a second-hand bookshop on one of Tamaki Makaurau's less fashionable streets. The linoleum floor was so worn you could see the pattern underneath in places, and the espresso machine had a temperamental streak that required careful coaxing and the occasional threat. But it was work, and work was something Talia had never taken for granted. Ngahuia! The sharp voice of her manager Derek cut through the ambient noise of clinking cups and muted conversation. Office. Now. Talia's stomach dropped. She knew that tone. Had heard it twice already this week. Derek stood in the doorway of his cramped office, his round face flushed with the particular shade of red that meant trouble. Behind him, she could see the stack of invoices and the perpetual coffee ring stains on his desk, the detritus of a small business barely keeping its head above water. "I told you," he said without preamble, not bothering to invite her to sit down. "No more feeding the strays. This isn't a bloody charity, and I can't afford to have you giving away food every time some sob story shows up at our back door." Talia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It was just leftover rice, Derek. We were going to throw it away anyway." "That's not the point." His voice rose and she was grateful the office door was closed. "The point is, you attract them. Word gets around that there's a soft touch here, and before you know it, we'll have every homeless person in Auckland lining up outside. It's bad for business, Talia. Bad for our image." She wanted to argue, wanted to point out that throwing away perfectly good food while people went hungry was a kind of madness that made her chest tight with frustration. But she needed this job. Needed the steady, if meager, income that kept her in her tiny flat and her brother Teariki in the assisted living facility where he was slowly, painfully learning to manage his bipolar disorder. "I understand," she said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Do you?" Derek leaned forward, his small eyes narrowing. "Because this is your final warning, Talia. One more incident, and you're gone. And don't think I won't check the bins to see what's missing." She nodded and escaped back to the main cafe, her hands trembling as she picked up her cleaning cloth. The lunch rush was starting, and she threw herself into the familiar rhythm of taking orders, clearing tables, and pretending that her heart wasn't breaking just a little bit more with each passing hour. It was during the afternoon lull, when the cafe had emptied except for a lone student with a laptop and an elderly man nursing a long black, that she saw him again, through the rain-streaked window, standing in exactly the same spot as yesterday and the day before that. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but there was something ancient in his stillness that made Talia's breath catch in her throat. He was pale in the way of children who spent too much time indoors, his fair hair darkened by the persistent Auckland drizzle. The crutches he leaned on seemed too large for his slight frame, and his clothes, a navy jumper and dark trousers, hung loose on his thin body. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were the pale blue of winter sky, and they held an emptiness that no child should ever carry. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing there in the rain as if he had nowhere else in the world to go. This was the third day she'd seen him, third day of watching him stand there, motionless while commuters hurried past without a second glance. No parent appeared to collect him. No caregiver emerged from a nearby building. He simply existed in that spot, as if he'd been forgotten by the world. Talia's chest felt tight as she watched rainwater drip from his hair onto his shoulders. Derek's warning echoed in her mind, but it was drowned out by a louder voice, her grandmother's voice speaking in Tereo Maori, Aroha mai, Aroha atu, love received, love returned. The leftover fried rice from the lunch special sat in its metal container behind the counter, destined for the bin when Derek did his evening cleanup. Simple rice, scrambled with egg and spring onions, seasoned with soy sauce and sesame oil. Nothing fancy, but it smelled like comfort and tasted like care. Without allowing herself to think about consequences, Talia scraped a generous portion into a takeaway container. She wrapped it in a clean tea towel, one of the few luxuries she allowed herself, soft fabric in traditional Maori patterns that reminded her of home, and slipped out through the service door. The cold hit her immediately, biting through her thin cardigan and raising goosebumps along her arms. The boy looked up as she approached, his pale eyes widening with something that might have been fear. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his young features, the way his small hands gripped his crutches, as if they were the only things keeping him upright. "Don't say anything," she whispered, pressing the warm container into his cold hands. "Just eat." He said nothing, not a word, not even a whisper of acknowledgement. But when the aroma of the simple food reached him, something shifted in his expression. His fingers trembled as he lifted the plastic spoon, and he ate with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the value of every bite. Talia stood there in the rain, watching this strange, silent child consume her offering with a reverence that made her throat tight with emotion. He never took his eyes off her face, as if he was memorizing every detail, cataloging this moment of unexpected kindness in a world that had clearly offered him precious little of it. When the container was empty, he did something that stopped Talia's heart entirely. Those thin arms reached out and he embraced her with a desperation that seemed impossible from such a fragile body. It wasn't the casual hug of a child seeking comfort. It was the grip of someone drowning, clinging to the only solid thing in a vast and terrifying ocean. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that moment, standing in a grimy alleyway behind a struggling cafe, Talia felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Then he was gone, limping away on his crutches until he disappeared around the corner, leaving her standing alone in the rain with tears streaming down her cheeks and her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those hollow blue eyes, felt those desperate arms around her waist. Something about that boy was profoundly wrong, not just hungry, but broken in a way that went deeper than physical need. He haunted her thoughts with the persistence of unfinished business, a puzzle with pieces she couldn't even begin to identify. The next day, he was there again, and the day after that. By the fourth day, their wordless ritual had become sacred to her, a small rebellion against Derek's warnings and a larger defiance of a world that had taught her to look away from suffering. But on that fourth day, everything changed. The black Range Rover appeared like a storm cloud against the gray Auckland sky, its tinted windows reflecting the weak afternoon light. Talia watched from behind the cafe window as it pulled up across the street with the predatory grace of an expensive machine designed to intimidate. The man who emerged moved with the kind of authority that required no introduction. Tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Talia made in 6 months, he surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to owning everything he looked at. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face held the kind of cold handsomeness that graced magazine covers and boardroom portraits. The boy saw him and went rigid, every muscle in his small body tensing like a rabbit caught in a spotlight. The container of rice slipped from his hands, clattering to the wet pavement and spilling its contents across the concrete in a tragic scatter of wasted food. The man said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply pointed to the car with one manicured finger, and the boy obeyed without question, without protest, without even a backward glance at the woman who had fed him. Talia watched them drive away, her heart hammering against her ribs with a dread she couldn't name, as if she had just witnessed something terrible masquerading as normal. The next morning brought a woman in an immaculate charcoal suit who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate magazine. She placed an envelope thick with cash beside Talia's register and spoke with the crisp pronunciation of private schools and old money. "Mr. Rutherford extends his gratitude," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "But your services are no longer required." Talia stared at the envelope as if it contained something venomous. Through the paper, she could feel the thickness of banknotes. More money than she would see in 3 months of shifts, maybe 4. But somehow it felt like the dirtiest thing she had ever been offered to touch. The envelope of money sat on top of Talia's ancient refrigerator like a malevolent presence, untouched for 3 days and 3 sleepless nights. Every time she caught sight of it from the corner of her eye, thick, cream-colored paper that screamed expensive stationery, something twisted in her stomach with the violence of a knife turning in a wound. Her flat was a study in careful poverty. The refrigerator was old enough to have seen several decades of Auckland's changing skyline. Its white surface yellowed with age and decorated with the kind of magnets that came free with pizza deliveries. The kitchen table was a relic from a second-hand shop, its surface scarred by countless meals eaten alone. And the single window looked out onto an alleyway where the neighbor's cat conducted its nightly territorial disputes. But it was hers. Every crack in the walls, every stain on the carpet, every appliance that required coaxing and threats to function properly, all of it represented an independence that had cost her everything to achieve. And now this envelope, with its promise of easy money and its implicit demand for silence, felt like a violation of everything she had fought to build. Talia tried to convince herself that life had returned to normal. She served flat whites to business types who barely looked at her, cleared tables with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of becoming invisible, and pretended that the empty corner where the boy used to stand didn't feel like a missing tooth in her daily routine. But the pretense was wearing thinner with each passing hour. The other staff at Aroha Cafe had noticed her distraction. Mari, a 22-year-old university student who worked the morning shifts to pay for her psychology degree, kept shooting her concerned glances. James, the eternally cheerful barista whose easy smile masked a sharp intelligence, had offered twice to cover her tables when he noticed her staring blankly out the window. It was Mari who finally shattered her careful denial. She burst through the cafe door on Thursday morning, her usually neat ponytail disheveled from running, clutching her phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Talia, you need to see this," she said, shoving the screen under Talia's nose with the breathless excitement of someone who lived for gossip and had just struck gold. "This is mental." The headline made Talia's blood run cold. "Rutherford heir spotted at exclusive Remuera rehabilitation clinic." Below it was a photograph that stopped her heart. The same pale boy, the same crutches, the same haunted eyes that had been visiting her dreams for days. But now she had a name to go with the face that had been haunting her. Daniel Rutherford, 8 years old, son of construction magnate Nathan Rutherford, whose company had built half of Auckland's skyline and whose name appeared regularly in the business pages of the New Zealand Herald. "That's him, isn't it?" Mari whispered, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that comes from being close to a mystery. "The kid you were feeding." "Holy shit, Talia. Do you know who his father is?" Talia's hands shook as she took the phone, scrolling through the article with a growing sense of unreality. According to the social pages, a world she had never paid attention to before, populated by people whose problems seemed as distant as the troubles of fictional characters, Daniel suffered from a rare neurological condition that had left him unable to communicate with anyone. The article painted a picture of wealth beyond imagination and heartbreak that money couldn't touch. The best doctors that could be bought, world-renowned specialists flown in from London and New York, cutting-edge therapies that cost more per session than Talia made in a month. All of it useless against whatever had locked the boy away inside himself. But he had communicated with her, hadn't he? In his own way. He had eaten her rice with the reverence of someone receiving communion, had given her that fierce, desperate embrace that still made her chest ache when she thought about it. Whatever walls surrounded Daniel Rutherford, she had somehow found a crack in them, a moment of connection that had felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. The days that followed brought more articles, more glimpses into a world so far removed from her own. It might as well have existed on another planet. The Rutherford estate in Remuera, with its manicured grounds and harbor views, where Auckland's elite gathered for charity functions that raised more money in a single evening than most people saw in a lifetime. Nathan Rutherford's business empire, built on concrete and steel and the kind of ruthless ambition that transformed skylines and crushed competitors with equal efficiency. And through it all, the boy, Daniel, remained a mystery, wrapped in privilege and silence. The article spoke of his condition in the careful language of medical professionals and society journalists, describing symptoms and treatments with clinical detachment, but none of them mentioned the way his eyes had come alive when she handed him that container of rice, or the desperate strength in his thin arms when he had held on to her as if she were the only real thing in his world. Talia found herself dreaming about him every night, not the sweet dreams of their quiet moments in the alley, but nightmares where he was screaming for help from behind the windows of a mansion that looked more like a prison. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing with the absolute certainty that something terrible was happening to him. The dreams were so vivid she could smell the antiseptic cleanness of hospital corridors, hear the echo of expensive shoes on marble floors, feel the weight of silence that pressed down like a physical thing. During her breaks at work, she found herself walking past the corner where he used to stand, as if proximity to the place might somehow conjure him back into existence. The spot felt haunted now, charged with the memory of those brief moments of connection. Other people hurried past without a second glance. It was just another piece of sidewalk to them, just another anonymous corner in a city full of them. But for Talia, it had become sacred ground. The rational part of her mind kept insisting she was being ridiculous. He was a Rutherford, for crying out loud. He lived in a world of private schools and trust funds, of medical care that most people could only dream of. What could a cafe waitress from the wrong side of town possibly offer that his father's wealth couldn't provide 10 times over? But late at night, when Auckland's traffic had quieted to a distant hum and her flat felt too small and too empty, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel needed her in a way that had nothing to do with money or medicine or any of the complicated machinery of privilege. There had been something in his eyes, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude, as if he had been waiting for her specifically, as if their meeting had been inevitable rather than accidental. The knock at her door came at nearly midnight on a Tuesday, sharp and authoritative in a way that suggested the person on the other side was not accustomed to being kept waiting. Talia opened it to find a woman who looked like she had stepped out of the pages of Metro magazine. Perfectly groomed silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon, expensively cut suit in charcoal gray, and the kind of understated jewelry that whispered of old money and older power. "You're Talia Nungahuya?" the woman asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Her accent carried the crisp vowels of private education and British heritage, the kind of pronunciation that had once ruled New Zealand and still commanded respect in certain circles. Talia nodded, suddenly acutely conscious of her old pajamas and bare feet, of the way her flat must look to someone accustomed to luxury. The woman's eyes took in everything: the second-hand furniture, the magnets on the fridge, the careful poverty that Talia had worked so hard to rise above, and filed it away with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing and categorizing. The woman extended a business card with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades managing the intersection of wealth and public relations. The paper was thick, expensive, with embossed lettering that caught the light from the hallway. "Mr. Rutherford would like to see you," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from speaking for people who moved markets and shaped cities. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the concrete with mathematical precision, then paused as if remembering something important. When she looked back at Talia, there was something in her expression that might have been warning, or perhaps assessment. "I trust you understand the delicate nature of this situation," she said carefully. "Mr. Rutherford is a very private man, and he values discretion above almost all other qualities. I hope we can count on yours." The implicit threat hung in the air between them like smoke from an expensive cigarette. Then she was gone, leaving Talia standing in her doorway with a business card that felt heavier than it should, staring out at the empty street and wondering if she was about to step through a door that would change everything, or destroy her completely. The card was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Margaret Ashworth, it read. Senior Director of Public Relations, Rutherford Industries. No flowery descriptions, no unnecessary details. Just a name, a title, and a phone number that somehow conveyed more power than a full-page advertisement. Talia closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Tomorrow morning would mark the end of one life and the beginning of something else entirely. something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing that the only choice was to jump or be pushed. She looked at the envelope on the refrigerator, still untouched, still radiating its promise of easy money and complicated consequences. Then she looked at the business card in her hand, with its implicit promise of answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Whatever tomorrow brought, she knew there would be no going back. The Rutherford estate rose from the Remuera hillside like something out of a magazine spread, all clean lines and glass walls that caught the morning sun and threw it back in brilliant shards. Talia sat in the back of the hired car Margaret Ashworth had insisted on sending transport, and watched the city fall away below them as they climbed through streets lined with million-dollar homes and perfectly manicured gardens. Her best clothes felt shabby in comparison to the wealth surrounding her. The navy dress she'd bought for job interviews hung loose on her frame, and her only pair of good shoes pinched at her toes. She'd scraped her hair back into what she hoped was a professional-looking bun, but strands kept escaping to frame her face in ways that made her feel even more out of place. The security gates were wrought iron masterpieces that probably cost more than most people's cars. They swung open silently as the car approached, and Talia caught sight of cameras nestled discreetly among the native flax plants that lined the driveway. Everything about this place whispered of money. Not the flashy, nouveau riche kind, but the old, established wealth that didn't need to announce itself. A security guard escorted her through gardens that looked like they belonged in a museum, all carefully planned native plantings and harbor views that made her catch her breath. The house itself was a study in modern minimalism, glass and steel and concrete arranged in ways that seemed to defy gravity. It was beautiful, undeniably, but there was something cold about it, something that made Talia think of expensive mausoleums. Nathan Rutherford was waiting for her in what could only be described as a study, though it was larger than her entire flat. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Waitemata Harbor, and the walls were lined with books that looked like they'd been chosen more for their aesthetic value than for reading. He stood behind a desk that seemed to be carved from a single piece of dark wood, and when he looked up at her entrance, Talia felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing. He was exactly what she'd expected from the newspaper photos. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded rooms without effort. His dark hair was streaked with silver that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old, and his eyes were the same pale blue as his son's. Though where Daniel's held emptiness, Nathan's held calculation. "Miss Angahuya," he said, and his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, leather that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, and waited for her to sit before taking his own seat. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the expanse of polished wood, and Talia had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being assessed like a piece of property he was considering purchasing. "My son," Nathan said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "has not spoken to anyone in 3 years. He doesn't eat with the family. He barely acknowledges the presence of his carers. The specialists tell me it's related to his condition, a form of selective mutism brought on by neurological trauma." Talia said nothing, sensing that he wasn't finished. "And yet," Nathan continued, leaning forward slightly, "my security team informs me that he was seen eating with you. Simple food, they said, rice and vegetables, and he finished every bite." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Talia could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of Nathan's gaze as he studied her face for some clue to the mystery she represented. "I want you to come and work here," he said abruptly. "Live here if necessary. Continue whatever it is you've started with Daniel. Money is no object. I'll pay you more than you could make in 10 years at that cafe. I'll arrange for you to continue your education if you wish. All I ask is that you help my son." The offer hit her like a physical blow. More money than she could imagine. The chance to escape the endless cycle of minimum wage jobs and overdue bills that had defined her adult life. And yet something in Nathan's tone, something in the cold perfection of his home, made her hesitate. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could hire anyone. Specialists, therapists." "I have," Nathan interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "I've hired the best money can buy. Nothing works. But you got through to him somehow. You made him trust you." As if summoned by their conversation, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Daniel stood there in pressed trousers and a navy jumper that looked like it had never been wrinkled, his pale hair neatly combed, and his crutches gleaming with expensive chrome. But it was his eyes that stopped Talia's breath. No longer empty, but bright with something that might have been hope. When he saw her, his face transformed. The careful blankness that had been his default expression melted away, replaced by a smile so pure and joyful that it made Talia's chest tight with emotion. He moved toward her with more animation than she'd ever seen from him, and when he reached her chair, he simply stood there, radiating a happiness that needed no words. "Hello, Daniel," she said softly, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. Behind them, Nathan was watching the interaction with the intensity of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. When Daniel spontaneously reached out and took Talia's hand, holding it with the gentle reverence of someone handling something precious, Nathan's composure cracked just slightly. "He's never done that," he said, his voice rough with an emotion Talia couldn't quite identify. "Not with anyone. Not even with me." It was then that Talia noticed the woman standing at the top of the sweeping staircase that dominated the entrance hall. She was elderly, but still striking, with perfectly styled white hair and the kind of posture that spoke of decades of finishing school and social prominence. Her clothes were expensive but understated, the uniform of old money, and when her eyes met Talia's, there was something in them that made Talia's skin prickle with unease. "So," the woman said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on any subject, "you're the girl with the rice." She descended the stairs with measured grace, each step calculated for maximum impact. When she reached the bottom, she extended a hand with the kind of regal condescension that suggested she was bestowing a great honor. "I'm Margot Rutherford," she said, "Nathan's mother and Daniel's grandmother." The handshake was brief, perfunctory, and somehow managed to convey both welcome and warning in the space of a few seconds. Margot's eyes, the same pale blue that ran in the family, took in everything about Talia in a single sweeping glance, cataloging and categorizing with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime managing the intersection of wealth and social position. "I do hope you'll consider Nathan's offer," Margot said, though something in her tone suggested that hope was the last thing she felt. "Daniel has been challenging for all of us. Perhaps a fresh perspective is exactly what he needs." The words were perfectly polite, but underneath them Talia could hear something else, a subtle threat, a warning that she was being allowed into this perfect world on sufferance, and that her welcome could be withdrawn at any moment. Daniel's hand tightened in hers, and when she looked down at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her decision for her. Not hope this time, but desperation, the kind of silent plea that went straight to her heart and lodged there like a splinter. "I'll do it," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'll help Daniel." Nathan's relief was palpable, but it was Margot's reaction that stayed with her as she was shown to what would be her new room. The older woman's smile was perfectly pleasant, perfectly appropriate, and somehow it was the most terrifying thing Talia had ever seen. Talia's room in the Rutherford mansion was larger than her entire flat had been, with windows that looked out over manicured gardens and a harbor view that probably added 6 figures to the property value. The bed was draped in Egyptian cotton that felt like silk against her skin, and the ensuite bathroom had more marble than most people saw in a lifetime. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it felt like living inside a museum exhibit. The first few days passed in a careful dance of observation and adjustment. Talia spent her mornings with Daniel in the back garden, where he seemed most at ease. He still didn't speak, but he communicated in other ways, through drawings that grew more detailed each day, through the way he positioned himself between her and anyone else who approached, through small gestures that spoke of trust slowly building. The household staff treated her with polite curiosity. Maria, the housekeeper, was a practical woman in her 50s, who had worked for the Rutherfords for over a decade. She spoke with the easy authority of someone who understood the rhythm of the house better than its owners. "He's different with you," Maria observed one afternoon as they watched Daniel through the kitchen window. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass, carefully arranging colored pencils in order of spectrum. More present, like he's actually here instead of somewhere else. It was true. The vacant stare that had haunted his features during their encounters at the cafe had been replaced by something resembling alertness. He ate the simple meals Talia prepared for him, rice dishes mostly, comfort food that seemed to anchor him in the present moment. The expensive therapeutic meals designed by nutritionists remained untouched, but it was the drawings that truly revealed Daniel's inner world. Each day brought new sketches, and Talia began to understand them as a form of communication more complex than speech. There were pictures of the garden, rendered with surprising accuracy for a child his age. Pictures of the harbor, with boats that looked like toys from his bedroom window, and pictures of people, some kind, some threatening, all seen through the eyes of a child who noticed everything and spoke nothing. On her third evening in the house, Talia discovered something that made her blood run cold. She was helping Daniel organize his art supplies when she found a sketchbook hidden behind a vase of white lilies on his windowsill. The drawings inside were different from his usual work. Darker, more urgent, filled with shadows and sharp angles that suggested fear rather than observation. One drawing in particular stopped her breath. It showed a woman who looked remarkably like her, holding a plate of food and smiling. But behind her loomed a shadow with red eyes and reaching hands, and in the background was a gate that looked suspiciously like the iron barriers that surrounded the Rutherford estate. "Daniel," she said gently, sitting beside him on his bed, "can you tell me about this picture?" He looked at the drawing, then at her, then back at the drawing. His small hand reached out to touch the shadowy figure, and when he looked up at her again, his eyes held a fear that made her chest tight. That night, Talia couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the drawing, about the red-eyed shadow and what it might represent in Daniel's troubled mind. At 2 a.m, she gave up on rest and padded downstairs to make herself a cup of tea. The kitchen was dark except for the under-cabinet lighting that cast everything in a warm, amber glow. She was waiting for the kettle to boil when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that suggested someone who didn't want to be heard. Margot appeared in the doorway like a specter, wrapped in a silk dressing gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her white hair was perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour, and her pale eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "Trouble sleeping?" Margot asked, her voice carrying the kind of false concern that made Talia's skin crawl. "Just restless," Talia replied carefully, still adjusting to the new surroundings. Margot moved into the kitchen with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her domain. She opened a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of brandy that looked old enough to be a family heirloom. "Nathan tells me Daniel has been eating regularly," she said, pouring herself a measure of the amber liquid. "That's quite an achievement. The specialist said it might never happen. He just needed someone to understand him," Talia said. "Understand him." Margot repeated the words as if they tasted strange. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it, though I wonder if you truly understand what you're dealing with here." The older woman's eyes fixed on Talia with laser-like intensity, and suddenly the spacious kitchen felt cramped and airless. "This family has endured more tragedy than you could possibly imagine," Margot continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Daniel's condition isn't just neurological. It's the result of trauma that would break most adults. And here you are, a complete stranger, waltzing in with your rice and your good intentions, thinking you can fix what the best doctors in the world couldn't even diagnose properly." Talia felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet Margot's gaze. "I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm just trying to help. Are you?" Margot's smile was razor sharp. "Or are you trying to position yourself in this family for reasons that have nothing to do with Daniel's well-being?" The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a poisonous fire. Talia opened her mouth to defend herself, but Margot held up a perfectly manicured hand. "I've seen your type before," the older woman said. "Young women who see an opportunity in tragedy, who think they can ingratiate themselves with wealthy families through the children. It never ends well." With that, she glided out of the kitchen as silently as she had appeared, leaving Talia alone with her racing heart and a growing understanding that her presence in this house had made her an enemy of one of the most powerful women in Auckland. The next morning brought a crisis that put everything into perspective. Talia woke to find Daniel's room empty, his bed still made from the night before. A frantic search of the house revealed nothing until Maria found him in the greenhouse, huddled behind bags of potting soil with tears streaming down his face. In his small fist, he clutched a piece of paper, a drawing that made Talia's blood freeze. It showed a woman being dragged away from a little boy by dark figures, while in the background a white-haired woman watched with satisfaction. "She said you'd leave," he whispered, the first words anyone had heard him speak in 3 years. "She said everyone always leaves." Talia knelt beside him in the dirt, gathering his trembling form into her arms. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her voice fierce with protectiveness. "No one is going to make me leave you." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel Margot's presence in the house like a storm cloud gathering strength, and she wondered if promises were enough to protect a child from the machinations of a woman who had spent a lifetime getting exactly what she wanted. Daniel's drawing lay crumpled on the greenhouse floor, but its message was clear. He had seen the danger before anyone else had recognized it, and in his silent way, he was trying to warn her that the real battle for his soul was just beginning. The discovery of Daniel speaking sent shockwaves through the Rutherford household. Nathan canceled 3 board meetings to spend time with his son, sitting in the garden while Daniel drew pictures and occasionally whispered single words: bird, flower, Talia. The specialists were called in for emergency consultations, their excitement palpable as they witnessed what they had deemed impossible just weeks before. But it was the content of Daniel's hidden drawings that kept Talia awake at night. Each sketch told a story of a child who saw too much, understood too much, and carried burdens that no 8-year-old should bear. There were pictures of arguments, stick figures with angry faces and raised arms, pictures of a woman crying in what looked like a hospital room, and always lurking in the corners, that shadowy figure with red eyes that seemed to watch everything. These are quite disturbing, Dr. Sarah Chen, the family's psychiatrist, observed during her weekly visit. She spread the drawings across Nathan's desk like tarot cards, each one revealing another layer of Daniel's inner turmoil. The recurring shadow figure suggests he feels threatened by someone in his immediate environment. Talia's stomach clenched. She knew exactly who that shadow represented, but saying so would sound like paranoid speculation from someone who had been in the house for barely a week. Nathan studied the drawings with the focused intensity he usually reserved for construction blueprints. Could this be related to his mother's death? He asked quietly. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. It's possible. Children often struggle to process grief, especially when it's complicated by trauma. But these drawings suggest ongoing fear, not just past trauma. Has anything changed recently in his environment? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Talia felt 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, and she forced herself to meet Nathan's gaze directly. I'm the obvious change, she said, but Daniel seems comfortable with me. More than comfortable, he's thriving. Indeed he is, Dr. Chen agreed, which makes these drawings all the more concerning. Something is frightening him, and it's happening now, in the present. That afternoon, Margot invited Talia for tea in the formal dining room, a space so intimidating it could have been designed by someone who collected other people's insecurities. The table could have seated 20, but only 2 places were set, facing each other across an expanse of polished mahogany that reflected the afternoon light like dark water. Margot presided over the tea service with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades using hospitality as a weapon. The china was bone white with gold edges, probably worth more than most people's cars, and everything from the arrangement of the sandwiches to the angle of the napkins spoke of a perfectionism that bordered on obsessive. I thought it was time we had a proper chat, Margot said, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that fooled exactly no one. Woman to woman, as it were. Talia accepted the delicate cup and saucer, acutely aware that her hands were trembling slightly. The tea was Earl Grey, served at precisely the right temperature, but it tasted like sawdust in her mouth. You've done wonderful things for Daniel, Margot continued, selecting a cucumber sandwich with surgical precision. Nathan is beside himself with gratitude. He's even talking about making your position here permanent. The older woman paused to sip her tea, and in that moment of silence, Talia felt the weight of what was coming. But I wonder, Margot said, setting down her cup with barely a sound, if you truly understand what you're walking into. This family has a history, Miss Ngahuya, complications that run deeper than Daniel's condition. She reached into a leather portfolio that had been sitting beside her chair and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. When she slid it across the table, Talia's heart stopped. The folder contained medical records, psychiatric evaluations, hospital admission forms, and case notes that made her blood run cold. They were all about her brother, Teariki, and they painted a picture of mental illness that was far more severe than she had ever admitted to anyone. Bipolar disorder with psychotic episodes. Margot read from one of the reports, her voice as steady as a newsreader's. Multiple involuntary commitments, a history of violence toward family members. Quite concerning, really, when you consider that mental illness often runs in families. Talia's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to set down her teacup before she dropped it. How did you get these? Money opens many doors, dear, Margot replied with a smile that belonged in a shark documentary. The question is, what doors might these records close for you? Nathan is very protective of Daniel's well-being. I wonder how he'd react to learning that his son's new carer comes from a family with such instability. The threat was delivered with the same casual elegance with which Margot had served the tea. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet application of pressure to exactly the right spot to cause maximum damage. "You can't use my brother's illness against me," Talia said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Can't I?" Margot's eyebrows rose with polite surprise. Nathan's first wife, Daniel's mother, suffered from severe depression. The guilt he carries over not recognizing the signs, not getting her help in time. Well, let's just say he's rather sensitive about mental health issues in the people closest to his son. The weight of the older woman's words settled over Talia like a blanket made of lead. She thought of Daniel's trust, of the way his face lit up when she entered a room, of the progress he'd made in just a few short days. All of it could disappear with a single conversation. A few carefully chosen words whispered in Nathan's ear. "What do you want?" Talia asked. Margot's smile was triumphant but subtle, the expression of someone who had won a chess game several moves before her opponent realized they were in checkmate. "I want what's best for this family," she said. "And I don't believe that includes having Daniel become attached to someone who might disappear at any moment. Mental illness is so unpredictable, don't you think?" That night, Talia found a drawing slipped under her bedroom door. It was one of Daniel's, but different from his usual work. More urgent, more desperate. It showed a woman who looked like her, surrounded by dark shapes with reaching hands. But in the corner of the page, barely visible, was a small figure with crutches, standing guard. Below it, in Daniel's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were 3 words that broke her heart. "Please don't go." She sat on her bed, clutching the drawing to her chest, and realized that she was trapped between protecting Daniel and protecting herself. Margot had made it clear that there was no middle ground, no compromise to be found. The choice was simple and terrible. Abandon the boy who needed her or fight a battle she wasn't sure she could win against a woman who had spent 70 years perfecting the art of getting exactly what she wanted. Outside her window, Auckland's lights twinkled like fallen stars, and somewhere in the vast house a lonely child was probably lying awake, wondering if the one person who had ever truly seen him was planning to disappear like everyone else in his life. The drawing rustled in her hands as she smoothed it out again, studying Daniel's careful lines and the message they contained. He knew she was in danger, had probably known from the moment Margot first laid eyes on her, and in his silent way, he was trying to protect her just as she had tried to protect him. It was then that Talia made her decision. She might not have Margot's money or connections or social position, but she had something the older woman couldn't understand or fight against. Love that asked for nothing in return. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new threats, new attempts to drive her away from the child who had become the center of her world. But tonight, she would hold on to Daniel's drawing and the promise it represented, that some bonds were stronger than fear, deeper than manipulation, and more enduring than the carefully constructed walls that kept the Rutherford family trapped in their golden prison. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the fragile peace that Talia had built around her new life. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patel from Auckland City Hospital, and his words hit her like physical blows. Respiratory failure, kidney complications, immediate intervention required. Tia Riki was dying. Talia sat on the edge of her expensive bed in her beautiful room, phone clutched in her trembling hand, and felt her world collapse. Her brother, the gentle giant who had protected her through their chaotic childhood, who had taught her to weave flax and speak te reo Maori, who had loved her fiercely even as his mind betrayed him, was fighting for his life in a public hospital ward while she lived in luxury with strangers. "The procedure he needs," Dr. Patel explained, with the careful neutrality that medical professionals used when discussing money, "isn't available through the public system for several months. There's a waiting list, you understand. But privately, the number he quoted might as well have been $1 billion. Talia's entire life savings wouldn't cover a tenth of the cost, and that was before considering the ongoing care Tia Riki would need during recovery. She was trapped in the cruelest kind of mathematics, having enough money to see the solution clearly, but nowhere near enough to reach it. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and made her way to Nathan's study, practicing the words she would use to ask for help. The house felt different at this hour, less like a home and more like a museum after closing time. All shadows and silence and the weight of expensive things gathering dust. Nathan was already awake, standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink. He looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, the silver in his hair more noticeable. "Talia," he said without turning around. "You're up early." She told him about Teariki, about the hospital call, and the impossible choice between her brother's life and Daniel's well-being. Nathan listened without interruption, his face carefully neutral, and when she finished, he was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he had heard her at all. "I can help," he said finally. "The money isn't a problem. I spend more than that on lunch meetings, but I need something from you in return." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her knees weak. "Anything," she said, and immediately regretted the word. Nathan turned to face her, and there was something in his eyes that made her stomach clench with unease. "I want you to sign a contract. 5 years minimum. You live here, work exclusively with Daniel, and submit to regular psychological evaluations to ensure your stability. No outside employment, no unsupervised contact with media, and certainly no romantic relationships that might distract from your duties." The terms hit her like a slap. 5 years of her life, locked away in this beautiful prison, watched and monitored and controlled. 5 years of being Margot's enemy, of fighting battles she wasn't equipped to win, of living under constant suspicion. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Nathan's smile was cold as winter rain. "Then you're free to leave whenever you choose. But the money for your brother, well, that would be a personal favor between friends. And friends don't make demands on each other, do they?" The choice was elegant in its cruelty. Accept his terms and save Teariki's life at the cost of her own freedom, or watch her brother die while clinging to principles that wouldn't comfort her at his funeral. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course," Nathan replied, "but not too much time. According to Dr. Patel, your brother's condition is quite urgent." Talia left the study feeling like she'd been filleted by an expert. She went through the motions of the day, helping Daniel with his drawings, eating meals that tasted like cardboard, making conversation that felt like performance art. But underneath it all, she was drowning in the impossibility of her situation. It was Daniel who noticed her distress first. During their afternoon art session in the garden, he abandoned his colored pencils and climbed into her lap, wrapping his thin arms around her neck with the fierce protectiveness of someone much older. "You're sad," he whispered against her ear, like the lady in the hospital. The reference to his mother, the woman who had died while he watched, helpless and uncomprehending, broke something inside Talia's chest. She held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the lavender fabric softener that Maria used on his clothes, and wondered how many people he would have to lose before the universe decided he'd suffered enough. That evening, as she sat in her room staring at her phone and willing herself to call Nathan with her decision, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find an envelope on the floor, thick, cream-colored paper that she recognized immediately. Inside was a cashier's check for exactly the amount Dr. Patel had quoted, along with a handwritten note in Margot's perfect copperplate script, "For your brother's medical expenses. No strings attached. In exchange, I trust you'll do what's best for everyone involved." The note was signed with a flourish that looked like a smile, and attached to it was a plane ticket to Wellington. One way, departing the next morning. Talia stared at the check until the numbers blurred through her tears. It was salvation and damnation wrapped in elegant stationery, the answer to her prayers delivered by the last person on earth she wanted to owe a favor to. She thought of Teariki, probably lying in a hospital bed right now, his body failing while his mind struggled to understand why he felt so sick. She thought of Nathan's cold smile and his 5-year contract, of the golden cage he was offering in exchange for her brother's life. And she thought of Daniel, asleep somewhere in this vast house, probably dreaming of rice and kindness and the possibility that someone might stay long enough to love him properly. The choice should have been easy. Teariki was her blood, her family, the person who had loved her longest and most unconditionally. Daniel was a stranger's child, a complication she had stumbled into by accident, a responsibility she had never asked for. But as she sat there in her beautiful prison, holding Margot's poisoned gift and feeling the weight of impossible decisions, she realized that love wasn't always about blood or obligation, or the debts we owed to the past. Sometimes it was about the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, to fight when surrender would be safer, to love when everything and everyone conspired to make you walk away. The check rustled in her hands as she folded it carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict, battles she wasn't sure she could win, and pain that would probably destroy her. But tonight, she would stay. For Daniel, for herself, and for the possibility that some bonds were stronger than money, deeper than manipulation, and more enduring than the carefully constructed walls that kept broken families trapped in their beautiful, terrible isolation. The cashier's check lay on Talia's dresser like a loaded gun for 3 days. She didn't cash it, didn't call the hospital, didn't tell anyone about Margot's poisonous gift. Instead, she threw herself into caring for Daniel with the desperation of someone trying to prove that love could overcome money. That connection mattered more than contracts. But Tayariki's condition was deteriorating. The twice-daily calls from Dr. Patel painted an increasingly grim picture. Kidney function declining, fluid building in his lungs, time running out with each labored breath. The public waiting list hadn't moved, and the private specialists were politely but firmly clear about their payment requirements. On Thursday morning, Talia woke to find Daniel's room empty. Not just empty, abandoned. His bed was made with military precision. His art supplies arranged with obsessive neatness, and pinned to his pillow was a drawing that made her blood freeze. It showed 2 figures, a woman and a boy, being pulled apart by dark hands. Between them, money scattered like confetti, and in the background a white-haired figure smiled from behind iron gates. "Daniel!" she called, racing through the corridors of the mansion with her heart hammering against her ribs. "Daniel!" The search consumed the entire household. Nathan canceled meetings, the staff abandoned their duties, and even Margot emerged from her private wing to coordinate the effort with military efficiency. Security footage showed Daniel leaving through the kitchen door at dawn, his crutches leaving distinctive marks in the morning dew. They found him in the gardener's shed, curled up behind bags of potting soil with tears streaming down his face. He was clutching one of Talia's hair ties, a simple elastic band that she'd lost days ago, and when she knelt beside him, he threw himself into her arms with the desperate strength of someone drowning. "She said you'd go," he whispered against her neck, the words barely audible through his sobs. "She said the money was more important. She said everyone always chooses the money." Talia's vision went white at the edges. "Who said that, sweetheart?" "Grandmama." Daniel hiccuped. "She showed me the envelope. She said you were just like all the others." The revelation hit Talia like a physical blow. Margot hadn't just been manipulating her. She'd been manipulating Daniel too, poisoning his fragile trust with the same casual cruelty she'd used to threaten Talia's future. That afternoon, Nathan appeared at her door looking like a man who had aged a decade in a few hours. His usually perfect composure was cracked, his expensive suit wrinkled, and there was something in his eyes that might have been fear. "He's regressing," he said without preamble. "Doctor, Chen says the trauma of thinking you were leaving has undone months of progress. He won't eat, won't speak, won't even acknowledge the staff. He just sits in his room drawing the same picture over and over." Nathan pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph that broke her heart. It was Daniel's latest drawing, stick figures of a woman and a boy, joined by a red line that looked suspiciously like blood. Below it, in his careful 8-year-old handwriting, were 4 words: "Please don't leave me. I need to ask you something," Nathan said, his voice rough with an emotion Talia couldn't quite identify. "And I need you to be completely honest. Do you love my son?" The question hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. Talia thought of Daniel's trusting smile, his desperate hugs, the way he drew pictures of their life together, as if documenting something precious and fragile. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Nathan's shoulders sagged with relief. "Then help me save him. The contract, the money for your brother, forget all of it. Just stay. Not as an employee, not as a hired carer, but as family. Daniel needs you, and I need to know that someone in this house loves him for who he is, not what he represents." The offer was everything she'd thought she wanted, but it came with a price she hadn't expected to pay. "What about Tayariki?" Nathan's smile was sad but genuine. "Your brother will have the best care money can buy. No contracts, no obligations. Consider it an investment in Daniel's future, and my peace of mind." That evening, Talia found herself in the most unlikely place. Margot's private sitting room, a shrine to old money and older prejudices, where family photographs and antique furniture created a museum of Rutherford history. Margot was waiting for her, dressed in her usual armor of pearls and propriety. But there was something different about her, a crack in the perfect facade that suggested the day's events had shaken even her legendary composure. "I suppose you've come to gloat," the older woman said, her voice carrying less venom than usual. "I've come to understand," Talia replied, settling into the chair across from Margot with more confidence than she felt. "You love Daniel too. I can see it. Even if you can't admit it, Margot's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Love? I've spent my entire life learning that love is a luxury this family can't afford. People who claim to love us want our money, our status, our connections. They stay until they get what they came for, then they disappear, leaving us to pick up the pieces. Is that what happened with Daniel's mother? The question hit its mark. Margot's perfect composure cracked completely. And for a moment, Talia saw not the formidable matriarch, but a grieving grandmother who had watched her family fall apart and didn't know how to put it back together. Eloise was fragile, Margot said quietly. Beautiful, intelligent, but fragile. She loved Nathan desperately, but she couldn't handle the pressure of being a Rutherford, the expectations, the scrutiny, the constant performance. And when Daniel was born with his complications, she trailed off, but Talia could fill in the blanks. Postpartum depression compounded by the stress of a child with special needs, amplified by the fishbowl existence of Auckland's social elite. She killed herself, Margot continued, her voice barely above a whisper. In the garden, while Daniel watched from his bedroom window. He hasn't been the same since. The pieces of Daniel's trauma finally clicked into place. The silence, the fear, the drawings of shadows and abandonment. All of it stemmed from watching his mother choose death over the burden of loving him. I won't leave him, Talia said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Not for money, not for threats, not for anything. He's already lost too much. Margot studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in her pale eyes. You really mean that? I do. The older woman was quiet for so long that Talia began to wonder if she'd fallen asleep. Then so softly that it was almost inaudible, Margot spoke again. I was wrong about you, she said. I thought you were like all the others. But the others would have taken the money and run. You're still here. That night, Talia slipped into Daniel's room and found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the hollow eyes she remembered from their first meeting. When he saw her, he didn't smile or reach for her, just looked at her with the weary resignation of someone who had learned not to hope. I'm not going anywhere, she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. Ever. Do you hear me? I'm staying right here with you. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Daniel's thin arms crept around her waist, and he held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had taught him that everything good eventually disappeared. Promise? He whispered against her shoulder. I promise, she whispered back, and felt something inside her chest settle into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. Outside Daniel's window, Auckland's lights twinkled like fallen stars, and somewhere in the vast house, two broken hearts began the slow, careful work of learning to trust again. 6 years later, the renovation of the mansion's east wing had transformed what was once a cold, unused space into something that hummed with life and purpose. Te Maori Ora, the essence of life, was what they had decided to call it, and the name felt right in a way that made Talia's chest warm every time she heard it. The therapeutic center occupied rooms that had once gathered dust behind locked doors, but now echoed with children's laughter, quiet conversations, and the soft scratch of pencils on paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows had been installed to let in Auckland's changeable light, and the walls were painted in warm earth tones that made even the most anxious visitors feel welcome. Talia stood in the main activity room, watching a group session where parents and children worked together on art projects designed to build communication and trust. At 29, she had grown into her role as director with the kind of natural authority that comes from genuinely caring about the work. Her hair was longer now, often braided with traditional Maori patterns, and she wore clothes that reflected both cultures, professional blazers paired with punamu pendants, or flowing dresses in traditional earth tones. In the corner of the room, Teariki worked with a 7-year-old boy who reminded Talia painfully of Daniel at that age. Her brother had recovered from his medical crisis stronger than ever, and his own experiences with mental health struggles had made him an incredibly effective therapist. The kidney procedure had been successful, but more importantly, having a purpose, helping other families navigate the complexities of childhood trauma, had given him a stability that no medication had ever provided. Miss Talia, called Sophie, an 11-year-old girl who had been coming to the center for 3 months. Can you help me with this drawing? Talia knelt beside the girl's chair, studying the crayon drawing that showed a family of stick figures holding hands in front of a house. What would you like help with? I want to draw my stepdad, Sophie said, but I don't know what color to make him. He's nice, but he's not my real dad, you know. The question was one Talia heard often in various forms. Children trying to navigate the complex emotions of blended families, of loss and love existing in the same space. "What color feels right to you?" she asked gently. Sophie considered this seriously, then reached for a purple crayon. "Purple," she said with sudden confidence, "because he's different from my dad, but still good." From across the room, Talia caught Nathan's eye. He was sitting with a father who was struggling to connect with his autistic son, offering the quiet patience that had become his trademark. At 54, Nathan had softened in ways that made him almost unrecognizable from the cold businessman who had first offered her a contract. His hair was more silver than brown now, and he wore cardigans instead of suits, as if the formal armor was no longer necessary. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, with Daniel always at the center. They shared meals, shared decisions about the center, shared the quiet satisfaction of watching troubled children find their voices. There were no labels, no dramatic declarations, just a deep partnership built on mutual respect and their shared love for an extraordinary boy who had taught them both what family really meant. "How's the birthday boy?" Maria asked, appearing at Talia's elbow with a tray of afternoon tea. The housekeeper had become something like a second mother to Daniel, and at 61 she ruled the expanded household with gentle efficiency. "Nervous," Talia admitted. "He's been working on his speech for weeks. Today was Daniel's 14th birthday, and he had insisted on marking it with something special. A presentation to the center's supporters about his journey from silence to advocacy. The boy who had once communicated only through drawings was now planning to speak to a room full of adults about the importance of believing in children that others had given up on. As if summoned by their conversation, Daniel appeared in the doorway. At 14, he had grown tall and lean, his fair hair darker now and styled with the careful attention of a teenager, conscious of his appearance. The crutches were gone. Years of physical therapy had strengthened his legs enough that he only needed them when he was tired, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. "Is it time?" he asked, and Talia could hear the nervous excitement in his voice. "Almost," she said, straightening his tie, a deep blue that brought out his eyes. "Are you ready?" Daniel's smile was radiant. "I've been ready for 6 years." The presentation hall was packed. Auckland's social elite rubbed shoulders with families from all walks of life, united by their connection to Te Ora and the work it did. In the front row, Margot sat with perfect posture, her white hair immaculate and her expression proud. At 78, she had become one of the center's most effective fundraisers, using her social connections and formidable personality to champion children's mental health with the same ruthless efficiency she had once used to protect her family's reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan said from the podium, his voice carrying clearly through the room, 6 years ago my son couldn't speak to anyone. Today he's going to tell you why that changed, and why your support of Te Ora matters more than you might realize." Daniel walked to the podium with steady steps, and when he looked out at the audience, his eyes found Talia's immediately. She gave him the same encouraging smile she had offered that first day in the alley, and he smiled back with the kind of joy that made her chest tight with pride. "My name is Daniel Rutherford," he began, his voice clear and strong. "And this is Talia Ngahuia. 6 years ago, she fed me rice behind a cafe and changed my life forever." The speech that followed was remarkable, not for its eloquence, though Daniel spoke with the natural charisma of someone who had found his voice through struggle, but for its honesty. He talked about trauma and healing, about the difference between being cured and being understood, about the way love could exist in the simplest gestures. "People always ask what made the difference," he said, looking directly at Talia. "Was it the therapy, the medicine, the expensive treatments? And the answer is yes, all of those things helped. But what saved me was someone who saw me as a person, not a problem. Someone who didn't try to fix me, but just stayed." When he finished, the applause was thunderous, but Talia barely heard it. She was too busy wiping away tears and marveling at the young man who had grown from that silent, wounded boy into someone who could speak for children everywhere who felt invisible and unheard. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the center had returned to its peaceful quiet, Talia found Daniel in his room. He was sitting at his desk, working on something with the focused concentration she remembered from his early drawings. "What are you working on?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. Daniel looked up with a grin that was pure mischief. "You'll see," he said, then went back to his careful work. When he finished, he handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a photograph, the two of them from that very first day, captured by a security camera she hadn't known existed, but it wasn't the photograph that stopped her breath. It was the frame, carved into the wood in elegant script that had taken him weeks to perfect, were two words, in Tereo Maori. Ngamihi. Thank you, she whispered, understanding flooding through her. No, Daniel said, his voice soft but certain. Ngamihi, Talia. Thank you. For seeing me, for staying, for showing me that some people don't leave. He pulled up his sleeve then, and Talia gasped. There, tattooed on his forearm in the same careful script as the frame, were those same two words. Below them in smaller text was a date, the day she had first fed him rice behind a Roja cafe. Daniel, she breathed, when did you? Last week, he said proudly. Dad helped me find someone who would do it properly. It's a Tamoko design. Uncle Tiariki helped me research it. It means gratitude for a gift freely given. Talia stared at the tattoo, at this permanent reminder of their connection inked into his skin, and felt something settle deep in her chest. It wasn't the rice that had saved Daniel, she realized. It wasn't the expensive therapy or the beautiful center or even the love of his family. It was the choice, repeated every day for 6 years, to stay when leaving would have been easier, to love when indifference would have been safer, to believe in the possibility of healing when everyone else had given up hope. Ngamihi, Daniel, she whispered back, taking his hand in hers. Thank you for teaching me what family really means. Outside his window, Auckland's harbor sparkled under a canopy of stars, and in the peaceful quiet of a house that had finally learned to love without conditions, two hearts that had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances settled into the comfortable rhythm of home. Some stories, Talia reflected, don't have endings, just beginnings that stretch forward into a future bright with possibility. And sometimes the most extraordinary gift you can give someone is simply the promise that you'll still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as they need you to stay. She was just a simple waitress. He was a boy who wouldn't speak to anyone. She had no degree, no prestige. He was the son of one of New Zealand's wealthiest men, and it all began with a plate of rice, a small gesture, almost invisible, but one that changed both their lives forever. From that moment, she entered a world where she wasn't welcome. She was humiliated, discredited, tested to her limits, but what no one expected was that this simple woman would be the only one capable of healing a pain that no amount of money could erase. And when they tried to drive her away, the boy did something he had never done before, something that stopped the entire house, something no one would ever forget. Talia discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or mansions. It's measured in the lives we touch, the hope we kindle, and the courage to stay when everyone else walks away. When faced with the choice between easy money and a difficult promise, she chose love. When offered revenge, she chose forgiveness. When the world said, leave, she said, I'll stay. Ask yourself, if you found your own Daniel, someone invisible, forgotten, written off by the world, would you see them, really see them? Would you have the courage to offer not just food, but presence, not just help, but hope? In a world that teaches us to look away from suffering, would you choose to look closer? Perhaps we all carry a piece of Daniel within us, that part that feels unseen, unheard, unloved. And perhaps we all have the power to be someone's Talia, to choose compassion over convenience, to stay when it would be easier to leave, to love without expecting anything in return. If this story moved your heart, if it made you think about the Daniels in your own life, don't let this moment pass. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that they matter, and follow our channel for more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. Because sometimes the most extraordinary revolutions begin with the simplest acts of love.